and welcome to the University of New South Wales, Canberra, Managing a National Crises webinar. I am Paul Maddison, the director of the UNSW Defense Research Institute, and it is my privilege to be with you here today and to be moderating this panel. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I am sitting at the UNSW Canberra campus at the Australian Defence Force Academy. I'm speaking to you from the land of the Ngunnawal people, and I would like to pay my respects to the Ngunnawal elders, past, present, and emerging, and to pay my respects as well to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be with us for this webinar. Before we get underway, just a very quick word on the UNSW Defense Research Institute. Our role at the DRI is to bring greater alignment between UNSW's deep defense and security related research ecosystem, the Defense Department and defense industry primes, as well as key like-minded international partners to ensure that the ADF sustains a competitive operating advantage in a region where potential threats are evolving rapidly. As I'm sure you've figured out by now, my accent is Canadian, and you'll forgive me for saying that I come from a country that borders on madness. And I'm not referring to the politics of Justin Trudeau. That's an interesting time we find ourselves in, and it in many ways reflects the conversations we're going to have here this afternoon. And now to our panel. In a few minutes, I will introduce our impressive expert panel and engage them on the topic of managing national crises. We're going to run until about 12:45, quarter to 1, at which time we will turn to questions from the audience and until we wrap up around 1:20. So as the discussion unfolds, as you listen to our experts speak, as certain thoughts are tweaked, certain questions, then send your questions in and we'll be ready to go. We'll have the queue ready to go, and we'll get to as many of your questions as we can as we move forward. We're thrilled that we have more than 450 folks that have subscribed for this event. Many of you are UNSW alumni, but a sincere welcome to all of you. This is a thrilling turnout, an impressive turnout, and it just speaks to the importance of the subject in terms of managing national crises. You know, the headlines in Australia have been dominated by the management of two national crises for over 6 months: the bushfire crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic crisis. Both have been unprecedented in their scale, and I know that unprecedented is a word that we're kind of getting a little sick of, but truly, these two crises have been unprecedented. And they have affected entire populations, thrown economies at all levels into disarray, generated massive unemployment, exerted huge pressures on public infrastructure and services, and most tragically led to terrible losses of life. It has also put enormous strain on governments at the federal, state, and council levels to keep the machinery of governments ticking over, to minimize so far as possible the impacts on Australians, and to sustain public confidence. We know there are policies, response plans, and governance structures in place, obviously, to deal with bushfires and a pandemic, with bushfires having been honed by hard lessons learned over many years, and pandemic plans informed by previous outbreaks, such as SARS back in 2003. But nothing seems to have prepared us for the scale of what we have been enduring as a nation since late last year. And we know that the next bushfire season is just around the corner. And although it appears that Australia is managing the COVID-19 crisis remarkably well relative to many other nations, we know that we are not nearly out of the woods, that second and third or more waves of the virus are possible, and that a vaccine is still many, many months away, and perhaps future pandemics of different strains are also potentially out there in the years ahead. So here to make sense of this for all of us is a superb panel of experts whom I would like to briefly introduce now. Dr. Paul Barnes is head of the Risk and Resilience Program at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute here in Canberra. Paul has wide experience in public sector and specialist management roles at both the state and federal levels, including in critical infrastructure protection and biosecurity. Next, Cheryl Durrant is a climate emergency strategist and fellow of the Institute for Integrated Economic Research Australia. A 15-year veteran of the Australian Army, Cheryl also served for many years as a civilian leader in the Department of Defense, where most notably, she served as Director of Preparedness and Mobilization. Third is Rob Cameron. And Rob is the Director General of Emergency Management Australia within the Department of Home Affairs. In this position, Rob is responsible for the coordination of Australia's response to crises, including providing both physical and financial support to those impacted by disasters. And finally, Professor Jane McAdam. Jane is a Scientia Professor of Law and Director of the Andrew and Renata Kaldor Center for International Refugee Law at the University of New South Wales. Jane publishes widely in international refugee law and forced migration, with a particular focus on climate change, disasters, and displacement. So welcome to the panel. Great to have you here virtually online. I know some are joining me here in Canberra. I think Cheryl, you're in Tassie. Jane, I think you're in Sydney. So one of the neat things, I suppose, about the pandemic is going virtual allows people to perhaps more easily get together to work and to share around subjects such as this. So my first question, as we get the panel rolling, and I'll ask this to Paul Barnes, but happy for the panelists to signal they'd like to pile on at any time. Just to sort of set the stage, Paul, in your role today and in previous roles, you've been tracking Australia's preparations for and responses to natural crises over many years, especially as regards to bushfires and flooding events due to cyclones. But looking back a year, before last summer's catastrophic bushfire season and pre-COVID-19, how would you assess Australia's crisis response capacity, governance, and overall resilience?
Okay, sorry, I may have been muted there. There's a difference between capability and capacity. So capability obviously is what skills, what resources, human power, trained responders, people working in prevention, mitigation, action. How much of that do we have, or does an economy have? And then there's a capacity relates to how that's applied, whether there's always an available resource that you can then bring those particular elements into action. Now, this is not just response, but this is also prevention and mitigation effects as well. So in terms of pre-fire season last year, Australia has probably one of the best internationally arranged capabilities and capacities up to that time for response, recovery, anticipation and mitigation of a range of natural hazards, but also technical hazards as they manifest in, say, infrastructure systems, etc. The notion of unprecedented fire season you mentioned, Paul, is something that is probably very germane to this discussion today, in the sense that we do have two urban search and rescue heavy lift capabilities in Australia, Queensland and New South Wales, and they can respond to large natural disasters, tsunami effects, earthquakes, etc. And they do. So we have that capability and we have the capacity to do that both onshore and offshore. But what we've found with the early fire season starting, I think about September last year, north of Brisbane, Meridian Beach and other places were starting to be inundated, and the fire was reaching very close to urban areas, or did reach close to urban areas that had not been impacted in that proximity to where people normally live in the past. So as the fire season progressed and we had about 5.4 million hectares of damaged fire affected land in New South Wales and about 1.5 million hectares in Victoria, and also in WA and South Australia as well. Uh, those impacts were unprecedented in the sense that while most of the fires were started, obviously triggered by electrical activities, lightning strikes, etc., they propagated other fire causes in terms of impacting electricity networks and cabling, etc. And we progressed to the point where the capability that Australia had and sustains was impacted in sense of its capacity to respond to such a wide area and such multiple location in real-time effect. So in the sense that we do have, as I said, very, very effective capability, what we may be getting to moving forward to this year's fire season and those that will follow is that there is a capacity issue. Do we have enough? Can we sustain people in the field safely without fatigue setting in? Can we do the appropriate mitigation ahead of the next fire season, which obviously we are doing a lot now, and the communities impacted are recovering, possibly slowly, in some cases faster. But the critical question then is capability and capacity. What's the relationship between those two factors and resilience, nationally resilient economies, for example? One of the issues that we have here is that resilience is a systems concept. How can you be resilient? Often organizations can be deemed to be resilient. Can countries be deemed to be resilient? So we have to understand what the measures or what factors of resilience need to be considered, and therefore both private and public sector cooperation and obviously the community to work together to enhance that capacity. We have to be aware of where we are vulnerable, where we might, living on floodplains is a vulnerability. So there's a factor there, for example, with flooding. Living close to bushfire prone areas that are not necessarily, if your housing is not being designed or refitted and you haven't prepared for a bushfire season, you are vulnerable. So how do we respond? We can do the pre-planning. We can put the vulnerability reduction and mitigation efforts in. But until we know what's actually happening with the hazard as it manifests, as the bushfires start and as they move, we may not know exactly whether our vulnerability and mitigation efforts have been adequate in the pre-time to that event. So currently resilience for Australia, as you mentioned, the COVID-19 event, the pandemic is still, we're still working through that. We've been below the curve or close to the curve so for some time, as most of the listeners will appreciate. But one of the things that's enhancing resilience across the board is instances like the National Cabinet, the collaboration that I know is happening behind the scenes and many of the public may be seeing instances of, and possibly something that my other colleagues can talk to, is that the events that we've lived through and we may have to work through again in the next fire season and as the COVID-19 tail continues into the future, is that we are adapting very quickly and have adapted very quickly, and we are becoming more resilient. But the question for me will be, how do we sustain the gains in the way we govern the risk from both natural and technical hazards and disease hazards? How do we sustain what we've learnt as we've managed the issues to date?
Well, excellent, Paul. Thank you very much for that very sort of detailed layout. And you described where we were, and you described how Australia was well set up to manage what we were seeing as sort of the legacy scale of anticipated crises, noting that in the climate science space, there has been predictions for decades that the scale of natural disasters would continue to mount over time, and that we would need to get that capacity in place uh, in terms of pre-planning. But I'll move over now to Cheryl Durrant. It's based on what you've heard from Paul, Cheryl, um, and looking at the scale of the bushfire catastrophe last summer. What is your assessment of how well we responded at the federal, the state, the council, corporate, non-governmental organization levels? Do you think the policy framework that was in place was adequate to face the enormous challenges that this crisis presented Australia?
Well, thanks, Paul. And I largely agree with Paul. I think our operational response, and I'm choosing my words carefully, operational response to the bushfire crisis and also to the COVID crisis has been exceptional. Not perfect, but exceptional. The leadership and performance we've seen at all levels of government, particularly at state and local government, among business, our emergency responders and the ADF pulling together and responding and adapting to the crisis has really been very impressive. And my hat's off to all those responders who've been at the front line of the crisis, where some of us are stuck in our isolation hotels in Tasmania. I also think our coordination mechanisms worked very effectively as well. Again, not perfectly. There'll be lessons learned from the process, and we'll be learning those now and applying them going forward. But pretty well, as much as we could reasonably expect. Where I do feel that we have more to do as a nation at all levels, from individual through to the national government, is in those early stages of managing a crisis, the ones that needed to be executed often months or years, or some cases decades ahead of a crisis, in order to have the right things in place. So Paul has talked about mitigation. I'd also talk about prevention. So that first phase, are we investing enough in prevention and mitigation of crises before they occur? Because that's often the most effective use of our economic resources. There's some evidence that suggests that what we spend up front is repaid a lot more, up to perhaps a comparison of 1 to 7, into comparison with the cost of recovery. The second phase is that preparedness phase. And I think we saw in both crises, the coordination was good, but Australia was a little bit slow out of the blocks for that whole joined up response from individual to government in both crises. And as a sort of moderately competent ex-professional swimmer, you don't want to give away a start in a crisis. You want to get out of those blocks quickly. So I think there's more opportunity for implementing the very, very good National Resilience Framework, which actually talks about that individual connected to the community, connected to local through federal and state government, and a lot more practice. Practice makes perfect. Like, I might know the theory of golf, but I probably can't hit a golf ball anywhere near a golf hole. So I think we had, in certainly the ADF perspective, done a lot of disaster response exercising abroad. And actually, we hadn't had to respond to a crisis of this scale in Australia since, well, Cyclone Tracy would be the obvious example, even though we've had quite major and large responses to a range of crises. But that real big one, requiring that large response of the ADF, in this case, a mobilisation required also, we haven't seen within this generation of Defence Force planners. And so the capacity to sort of build more exercising and national exercising into our programs is something we need to consider. We also need to consider exercising with communities. I'm pretty sure that the ADF, which is quite well polished and practiced at evacuating people by ship, but hadn't done it with the communities where they actually ended up going to. So that's something we might consider as part of our management of crises going forward. Because as crises become larger, they overlap, longer durations, occurring concurrently. Anything we can gain as an advantage through mitigation, prevention, and preparedness before the crisis would just make that response that little bit better. I won't talk too much to recovery because I think the jury's still out on that. We've got a long way to go before we see the recovery from both the bushfires and the corona crisis. And another thing I think we haven't done particularly well is understand our vulnerabilities. Paul also talked about vulnerability. It's a major piece of work also done by Department of Home Affairs, the Australian Vulnerability Profile. As we go forward and the disasters are concurrent, responders and decision makers face choices about what to protect. And in order to inform those choices, we need to have a consensus on what we value, because that what we value makes us vulnerable. And it's not something you can do top down and say, well, you value economics over lives, we need to have a conversation with the people of Australia to get that consensus on vulnerability. And that also leads us to more trust and acceptance in response, because we're going from the same sheet of music in this case. And a last thing I'll say is systemic risks. Who would believe that Australia would have been talking about masks pretty much continuously from early January? And one thing we didn't have enough of was obviously those masks, both in the bushfire crisis and the COVID crisis. And as Paul has said, it also exposed some of those systemic risks and vulnerabilities we have as a nation. Do we understand our supply chain vulnerability well enough? Do we have transparent information of where those masks are produced and come from, and the first, second and third tier in a supply chain? We also had the obvious cascading risks where cuts from the bushfires to the major transport infrastructure prevented postal services and supplies getting through. Cuts to electricity, ultimately, over time, your batteries run out and our communications are lost as well. So do we have enough resilience at all levels to cope with those unexpected cascading risks when we see them occur?
Thank you, Cheryl. Outstanding sort of description of some of the complexities around planning and response at all levels. And interesting that you mentioned Cyclone Tracy. My wife and her family are Cyclone Tracy survivors, and it has affected them throughout their adult lives. And my wife speaks frequently to how important it was to the people of Darwin to be supported by and evacuated by the ADF, specifically the RAF, back in '74. So what I've heard from Cheryl and Paul is that planning has been in place, that training has been in place, that lessons learned have been applied over time, but we have found ourselves in a situation where we're required at all levels to adapt on the fly in real time, and hopefully lessons are being identified and applied and becoming learned in real time as we continue to move forward into a future which might look like an almost perpetual series of crises management challenges. And so having said that, I'd now like to turn to Rob Cameron, who's the one person on the panel who is in government at the Commonwealth level. And not only is he in government, but he sits every day at the vortex of the Commonwealth's disaster and crisis response as the DG of Emergency Management. And so, Rob, you've heard Paul and Cheryl give their measured assessments of preparedness and response. From your perspective, how prepared were we for last year's bushfire and the ongoing pandemic? As a nation, were we able to lean on the existing policy framework to adequately address the crisis? And what enduring changes are you seeing being made that have been identified over the past, say, 3 months?
Oh, well, thanks, Paul, and thanks, colleagues, for the preceding remarks. I might also just say thanks to UNSW for hosting today. And thank you to my colleague, David Nockels, who I'm sure is one of the participants for suggesting that I participate today. So thanks for all of that. So, Paul, how well prepared? Well, we're well prepared within the scope of those things that we have experience in and that we understand. And to borrow a phrase from one of my wise predecessors, things that we can imagine. It's a bit hard to be prepared for things that we can't imagine, that we can't envisage. And so we spend quite a lot of time pushing our thinking, pushing ourselves and the way we think and about what we think into things that we haven't previously considered. In terms of the bushfire, the black summer of bushfires, I would suggest to you that from both the Commonwealth perspective and the national perspective, I can't really talk to individual states' responsibilities. You would need one of the commissioners or fire chiefs to do that, I think, to do that justice. But from the national and or the Commonwealth perspective, I would suggest that we were well prepared for what we understood was possible. We had a good understanding of the underlying drought conditions across much of the eastern seaboard and central Australia. We had good advice from the Bushfire and Natural Hazards Cooperative Research Centre, the CRC, and the Met Bureau on the outlook. We understood about stream flows, soil moisture, vegetation curing. We understood that it was going to be hot and dry. And of course, we understood that it was going to be windy. All of those things combine, of course, to create the conditions that we saw tragically manifest over the course of the summer, right up and down the east coast and across the south, with smaller but nonetheless particularly locally powerful incidents in Western Australia and in Tasmania. The states and territories do a lot of work in advance of each summer for the fire season. At the Commonwealth and national level, as I said before, we're part of that. My organisation ahead of every summer, and we did this in some detail last summer in advance, briefed ministers, briefed the opposition at the Commonwealth level, briefed industry, the senior officials in the states and territories. We do that every year. That was in fact one of the lessons and recommendations after the 2009 fires in Victoria. That series of annual briefings that happened as well. So the potential was at least aired and discussed at the start of last summer as it started to unfold. In terms of the coronavirus, how prepared we are for that, well, I'll say this: the state of Australia's health system, and probably more accurately health systems, plural, sets us up well to achieve the results that we have seen to date. You commented in your introductory remarks, Paul, about your Canadian neighbours, the strength of the Australian health system and the willingness to act and leverage those system strengths has prevented, I think, what we could have seen, something akin to what's happening in the US or even the UK perhaps, and elsewhere in Europe. Leaning on existing frameworks, well, we've done that all the way through. Good governance, particularly in a federated structure. You know, Commonwealth government, 8 states and territories, 500 and some local governments, I understand. A complicated network at governments, at the level of governments, and then you can throw in the private sector, you can throw in academia, and of course the civil society, civil sector as well. We all lean on those existing frameworks, and we adapt and we try to make them as applicable to the situation that is unfolding. Bushfire circumstances, we're much more practiced at that, of course. I mentioned 2009 already. You mentioned that your family is a survivor of the impact of Cyclone Tracy. Well, I'm an Ash Wednesday survivor. Lost my house at Mount Maddison in 1983. We've been experiencing collectively natural hazard impacts for for as long as we've had people in Australia, and certainly in the current context since white settlement, since European settlement. Those systems, those frameworks serve us well. They are usually scalable. And of course, and just drawing that distinction that Paul Barnes made between capability and capacity, well, those existing frameworks are part of the capability. They have capacity limits. We have, for example, just to pick one particular capability, we have a national aerial firefighting fleet, but it is a set number of assets. With some flexibility at the margins around call when needed capability. And our colleagues at the Australasian Foreign Emergency Services Authorities Council, AFAC, I think do an outstanding job managing that national fleet on behalf of us all. That works well, but it is finite. Some aspects of the health system are finite. There are only so many masks, the example you used before, in the national medical stockpile, and require replenishment from time to time under demand. So we have leaned on our existing frameworks, and we will continue to do so. And just in finishing these remarks, Paul, you asked me about, are we seeing enduring changes? Well, I think it's too soon to call that just yet. There are several state inquiries into the bushfire underway. There's a Senate inquiry, both Senate inquiries, plural, into the fires and into the pandemic. And of course, there is the Royal Commission that is quite active as we speak, with hearings to start later this month. Big systemic changes to structures and underpinning resourcing, really though, matters for government to act on, and they will do so when they have advice, and in the case of the bushfires, particularly the outcomes of the Royal Commission. Cheryl made the point about refining procedural work as we go forward, learning lessons. Well, at the risk of sounding like a lessons management purist or a pedant, they're only learned if we implement them, and the circumstances that gave rise to them being learned in the first place never occur again, but they're built into our system. So I prefer to think of these things as we are observing things that give us insights for potential to change, and then we can make them into lessons and implement them. That's the approach we're taking in both reviewing our actions and our systems and our resourcing levels for the bushfires, and as we are starting to do so for the pandemic. I might just pause there.
Thanks, Rob. Really interesting to hear you describe, your thinking around preparation and response. And before I go to Jane, you seem fairly calm and very level-headed here today. But I imagine the op tempo within Emergency Management Australia has just been at 100% capacity or more over the past several months. How busy have you been? How hard has this been on your key staff? What kind of adjustments have you had to make in order to keep ahead of the scale and the rate at which these crises have enveloped Australians over the past several months?
Well, that's a good question, and thanks, Paul. Look, it is true we have been extraordinarily busy, but the approach I take and the staff of EMA, which are only number about 100 or 110 or so, and so we are few in number at the Commonwealth's Emergency Management Organisation, and I must say they are outstanding people. They're committed, they're diligent, and they are, even though I don't usually like using this sort of language, passionate about the work they do. So I'm blessed to have colleagues like that. But we're also part of a much larger piece of machinery. Since the machinery of government changes at the end of 2017, which formed the Department of Home Affairs, we were able to pull in from a much larger organisation than we had previously been able to staff crisis coordination teams, keep the Crisis Coordination Centre ticking over, form relationships with other parts of the portfolio that allowed us to deploy people from outside our own operation to do key roles. And so there's a whole lot of leverage that we gain from being much part of a much bigger whole. So that works very well there. The Australian community that the Australian public service serves deserves nothing less than that.
Yeah, well said, Rob. Thank you. And well done to your team. So Professor McAdam, I've known you for a couple of years now, and I know that your work examines how the impacts of climate change and disasters and how they may force people from their homes. And in some parts of the world, notably in Australia's backyard, out in the Pacific Island, out in Pacific Island countries, this has become an existential threat in countries like Tuvalu, Kiribati, Marshall Islands, and is likely to become even an existential threat in other parts of the world at an accelerating rate. But even close to home here in Australia, we've also seen some unprecedented displacement of local populations here due to the bushfires. Can you tell us more about this and what it may bode for our future?
Yes, Paul, and thank you very much for having me as part of this panel. Well, what we know is that every second, somewhere in the world, someone is displaced by a disaster. And as you've noted, Australia certainly hasn't been immune from this phenomenon. We don't tend to think of ourselves as a country that has internally displaced people, but in fact, the bushfires brought into sharp focus that indeed we had many, many thousands of people in exactly that situation. Now, I haven't seen any final calculation of the figures. It might be that someone else on the panel knows what they were, but certainly a rough estimate, if you take into account communities that were evacuated, tourists who might have been in those communities as well, we're looking at a figure into possibly the hundreds of thousands. Certainly the largest peacetime evacuation that Australia's ever seen. It exceeded what happened during Cyclone Tracy. And in fact, in data released just last week by the Internal Displacement Monitoring Centre in Switzerland, what we've seen is that last year, when it came to displacement within countries, 3 times as many people moved on account of disasters than conflict. Now, that's quite a startling figure. It was around 25 million people. And I think that if we take into account the impacts of climate change, which render disasters on steroids, and also have slower onset impacts when it comes to processes like drought and sea level rise, then it's really quite stark, the scale of displacement that we might see within countries, certainly, but also what happens if people are forced to move across international borders. There's no legal framework to deal with that. We have a refugee convention that deals with people who move across a border because they fear for their lives, they're at risk of persecution, but we don't have a comparable instrument when it comes to disaster displacement or people moving on account of the impacts of climate change. You mentioned our own region, the Pacific. Just a few weeks ago, Cyclone Harold, a really severe tropical cyclone, in fact, the second in 5 years, devastated a number of countries, including Vanuatu, with estimates that around 90% of the population were displaced. And we know that climate change is going to increase the severity and or the intensity of events like that, which means we do need to be thinking now about what kinds of frameworks we should be putting into place at the national, regional and international levels to respond to this phenomenon. As the Secretary-General of the Pacific Islands Forum said, the COVID-19 pandemic and its ensuing humanitarian and economic fallout give us a glimpse of what climate change might do if things go unchecked and we fail to act now. So I think the message that's been coming through this whole panel is that if we fail to plan, then we plan to fail. That's why for the last decade, at least, there have been a number of initiatives that have been trying to look at the human mobility side of this. And together, governments and NGOs, academics and international organisations have come up with a toolkit approach, if you like, which says that apart from mitigation, things that we need to be doing include prevention and preparedness. So these aren't an either or. We need to be doing all of these things, but certain things will have a greater resonance in particular contexts. So first of all, we need to be investing in disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. Cheryl cited a figure before about the kind of cost-benefit analysis of doing this. And in fact, The UN a number of years ago estimated that for each dollar spent on disaster risk reduction, there could be a 60-fold return. Now, even if it's not that high, we know from even local studies in the US, for example, that you can get at least a 3-time return on an investment. Cheryl, I think, mentioned 7-time. What we know is that investing early not only saves lives, but it makes good economic sense as well. It's already clear, though, that some people will be forced to move irrespective of what prevention measures we undertake. So in that regard, we do need to be turning our minds to humanitarian protection considerations. In Central America, for example, governments there have already come up with a regional set of guidance. They've said, look, all of us have had people displaced across our borders when there's been a disaster. It makes sense that we have a systematic approach to that and that we acknowledge up front that we will provide at least temporary protection so that people can get assistance and aren't forced back home into a humanitarian emergency. But we also, I think, particularly in Australia, need to be looking at how we enhance labour mobility and mobility schemes more generally. We already have seasonal employment schemes, for instance, focused on the Pacific. How can we scale those? How can we provide other opportunities that enable people to diversify their livelihoods, send remittances back home, but also with pathways for permanent stay, if ultimately that's what they choose and what circumstances dictate. The other thing to note is that by enhancing mobility and giving people opportunities to work elsewhere, through remittances, you can sustain the community back home, you can resource them, and it may be that ultimately the community can remain in place for longer, which by and large is what people want to do. So how do we enable that, but at the same time give people the resources they need? And finally, planned relocations can provide an alternative in some situations. They should always be approached as a matter of last resort for all sorts of complex reasons. We've got examples historically where planned relocations have very long-term intergenerational consequences. We only need to look at our own Indigenous communities here where people have been displaced from their land to see that. And Paul, as you and Rob also noted, even when you haven't, even in the context of Cyclone Tracy or other bushfires, that sense of displacement and of disconnection and being uprooted can stay with you for the rest of your life. So I think then in all of this, the message is loud and clear that preparation is key and that the costs of inaction far outweigh, the costs of inaction far outweigh the costs of action, whether that's at a level of people's lives and livelihoods or at the level of what makes economic sense.
Thank you, Jane. Fascinating overview. Certainly, I think there are a lot of Australians who look out into the Pacific Island community and don't necessarily see their potential futures reflected in some of the challenges being faced by members of the Pacific Island Forum. And so for you to speak about the potential for displacement as a recurring theme here in Australia, I think is a bit of an eye-opener and obviously requires some pretty significant policy planning and responses at all levels of government. And you mentioned Cyclone Harold, and before I go to this next question for the panel, for those who are attending here in our audience, we're going to go to your questions soon. We have a number that have come in, and so keep them coming. But you mentioned Cyclone Harold, Jane, and Category 5 cyclone that came into Vanuatu as devastating as Cyclone Pam in 2015 in a country with fairly limited emergency management response capacity. But what was really interesting as well was that it was concurrent to the pandemic. And we saw perhaps in a way that we hadn't anticipated before, how two separate but concurrent crises overlapped in ways that made it extraordinarily challenging for the Vanuatu government to address. And so we've talked a lot here, everyone has talked about capacity capability, in increasing complexity and scale of challenge. My question to the panel is, how do we move forward here in enabling the mechanisms at all levels of government and in civil society that will allow Australia to sustain the sort of the potential continuous onslaught of concurrent disasters over the next several years? I know that sounds like perhaps an alarmist way to shape the question, but I guess what it comes down to is, if the pandemic continues and we're into another bushfire cycle next year or the year after, Rob, Cheryl, are we prepared for that? Rob, do you want to jump in?
Well, I think I better. Thanks, Paul. So one of the things that we've been doing through EMA's crisis and security management branch and our disaster recovery branch is working on a national capability development framework for severe to catastrophic disasters. My colleagues Joe Buffoni and John Gibbon have been leading much of this work, working closely with states, of course, and also with industry. When we started the work, one of the very clear things we had to do was try to understand the sort of scenarios that would actually get us into that genuinely catastrophic space. And you can talk about big fires or big cyclones or a severe disease outbreak. But if you come at it from a sort of a single faceted perspective, it takes you quite a while to get to the what I routinely and perhaps somewhat erroneously, and Paul Barnes may have a different perspective on this, what I call a genuinely catastrophic. We came very quickly to understand that it's the concurrency of impacts that are likely to get Australians and the Australian system stretched, that genuinely causes those capabilities we discussed earlier to reach their capacity limits. So, when you have concurrent events, they compound and exacerbate. Cheryl and Paul Maddison, you spoke about climate change. Climate change is one of those impact and consequence multipliers. We're extremely conscious of this. So you have a rapidly changing climate where the natural hazards, particularly those meteorological ones, are more frequent, more intense, and we're seeing that. We're seeing very clear evidence of all of that. No way disputing any of that at all. It's something that's part of our underlying rationale for doing things the way we do them. You're seeing that impacting on the governance and resourcing structures that are also addressing fires, are also addressing flooding, and of course, much more currently and applicably nationally, are also being applied to the government's, again, plural, response to the pandemic. So we're appreciating the problem, and collectively we need to do things to address it. I'll just point out one big piece we're doing. In fact, we've done and working now with all stakeholders to implement the natural disaster risk reduction framework. Is a big piece, multi-sectoral, led and driven by my predecessor in this role, Mark Crosweller, and sets out those core, foundational priorities to deal with these sorts of things, so that risk is pulled out of the system in the first place. Language I've been using. Those core priorities from the risk reduction framework. Understanding disaster risk. Not everybody's on the same page as we are about the sources of threat and risk to Australia, Australians, things Australians value. emphasising and building into our governance system accountable decisions, enhanced investment. How do you monetize risk reduction? That gets the private sector on board. Governance, ownership and responsibility, making people, putting people in positions and making positions accountable, and governance structures competent to deal with the risk that we are hoping people will understand better in a disaster context. There's a broad sweep across catastrophic disasters, Paul.
Thanks, Rob. Look, I'm going to move to some of the questions that are coming in from our audience, because they're coming in pretty fast and furious. I know we won't be able to get to all of them this afternoon, but I'm just looking at one here. Now, we've talked, or you have talked about some of the positive responses to COVID and to the bushfire in terms of leadership, pre-planning, the policy framework in place. But the question here is that we've also seen extraordinary spontaneous volunteering at a local level and in a cross-sector sense. And the question being, have you seen best practice of all sectors and community groups working together on recovery? That's both on a bushfire and a COVID-19 response. And perhaps Cheryl or Paul, you might want to lead in responding to this. Paul, are you there?
Here we go. I'm back on again.
Good.
Look, I think best practice is a moving feast. I think a way of describing it is better practice. There's always been spontaneous volunteering throughout the firefighting industry over many years and in other elements of modern and older society. Best practice, I think, it doesn't really describe it. There's always going to be an emergent interest in communities and society to help. And we've seen that in many aspects over the last 6 months. One of the most important elements, I think, is how to harness the intent and willingness to assist. And that's something that I think Australia moving forward, and it's something across the globe. How do you harness and sustain the interest and the willingness to volunteer goods, services, and persons' times? But equally, volunteering has an edge to it as well, is that you can have the most amazing community and societal response, but can you really functionally use the intent and resources that are going to be made available through that volunteering process? Can you render safe the volunteering action where people are actively going into work with affected communities and affected elements of society? Will that volunteering process be done in a safe way? And in many cases, the overwhelming interest to support and to volunteer can't be utilized because that utilization can't be made in a safe and viable way. So that's a critical thing, I think, is that also aging volunteers. If we look at the rural bushfire fighting volunteer services across the country, most of our rural firefighting response is volunteer based with a kernel of professional element within it. Unless you can engender new people coming through to want to volunteer and to be trained and to sustain capability, that volunteering element can be less effective than what it could be made to be. But in all cases, we have to understand how to have spontaneous volunteering and utilize that particular phenomena. How can we raise, train and sustain, some military terminology, possibly words out of order, but how can we get new volunteers, train them, allow them to deploy, use the things that they've been trained to do in a safe way and sustain that volunteering action. So one of the critical things, in the past I was working with the Australasian Fire Authorities Council on community education, and that's another element of how do you deal with empowering affected communities, be they in rural areas, be they in rural urban areas, or even in urban spaces. How do you inform them so they can have self-protection. An element of risk communication is critical to the fore here. What could occur? How might these damages and disruptions occur, and what can an individual or community group or community groups do to render themselves safe, reduce the likelihood of harm manifesting? So, rather than best practice volunteering, better practice, better utilization of the intent and willingness of people to assist others.
Good, thanks, Paul. A question for Cheryl, and it refers as regards to the Australian Defence Force. In response to the COVID-19 and particularly the bushfire crisis, the Australian Defence Force Reserve was called out in early January and did great service in rural Australia, in New South Wales, Victoria in particular, bringing aid and support services to those in need, those displaced, as Jane has described, from the fires. And we all remember the images of one of the landing helicopter dock ships, Canberra or Adelaide, I can't remember which, evacuating folks from Malakuta. Cheryl, do you think, given the rate at which these sorts of national events may occur in the future, that the ADF force structure or the ADF mission set needs to be reviewed or amended in such a way that the ADF would be perhaps better prepared to deliberately respond in future to what we assume will be a similar series of events over time?
Thanks, Paul. A really good question. I think the thing to remember first, though, or to think of first, is the ADF's not a specialist in emergency response. The emergency responders have higher sets of skills in the emergency response skill set. That's their main business. And in many cases, they're delivering those responses more economically, effectively than the ADF is. The ADF is a surge capacity, not a sort of general business as emergency response. It can do the job, but its core business still has to focus on the threats of conventional conflict, because those threats haven't gone away. In fact, if you do some probability modelling, the probability of conventional conflict on some estimates is actually greater than that of pandemics. So I think the dilemma for the defence is it has to do its core job well. It is experiencing a greater call upon its services to support emergency services, civilian organisations, local councils and state governments. So I think perhaps the more critical question is what's missing in Australia's emergency response. Is it time, instead of continuing to draw upon the ADF, who often actually the reserve shares volunteering both to the ADF and emergency services, so it's a single pot of people you're drawing your surge capacity from, is to consider whether we need a civil defence force, as some nations have had, or whether we need to invest in greater individual and community capacities to respond, so that the ADF is still only called upon when really needed, rather than as becoming a first responder of choice, which it's not really designed to.
Great, thank you, thanks. Rob, is this a conversation that has come up in Canberra, that as you've been through various meetings and briefing cycles, is as you look out and as you're identifying lessons and looking for ways to do things better next year, perhaps, or the year after, are you seeing best practices being defined? Are you seeing obstacles, perhaps, that are proving a bit difficult to get around in terms of inevitable tensions between various organizations when it comes to a whole of nation response to these kinds of crises?
Well, thanks, Paul. A couple of good questions wrapped up in there. I might just go back to one of the responses, questions you asked about best practice and volunteers and recovery. I think you also rolled that in. Paul, I think, gave a very good answer about volunteers. Let me just talk about, just briefly, and I'll get to your questions about what I'm seeing at the moment, following on from Cheryl's answer there. But just talk about recovery just for a second, if you can permit me that. Really important that when we in isolation and with a national perspective start talking about what could or couldn't be, or what isn't best practice in particularly community recovery and individual psychological recovery, psychosocial at a household, neighbourhood, community level, that we appreciate that those circumstances are all different. People's own values and approaches, personal philosophies, the things they hold dear, things that are important at a community level differ markedly from one to another. And so particularly from a community recovery perspective, just as much for bushfires as for pandemics, really important to make sure that those initiatives are driven from the ground up. And this is one of those fundamental underpinnings of the way that we've learned to do, if I can couch it like that, learned to do disaster recovery in this country. That's critical. That's not to say that that for want of a better description, Paul, top-down, government-driven and implemented things like disaster relief grants, loans, immediate relief payments, those sort of things aren't critical, but and they are critical, they are essential, but the long-term disaster recovery is and must be driven a lot from local. And my colleagues in the National Bushfire Recovery Agency, Andrew Colvin's organisation, will be focusing on tailoring as much as they can in that regard. Sorry, just thanks for that opportunity to add that. What am I seeing in Canberra and in response to things, ideas like a civil defence force that Cheryl suggested? Well, yes, of course we are. We're kind of cataloguing all the sorts of things that could make and could further strengthen the Australian response to that. And as I said before, when I was to disasters, and as I said before, when I was talking about the Royal Commission and the other reviews that are underway, those are decisions for the government to make about where the investments are made, whether or not the government asks the Defence Force to reshape its structure and to engage in developing other capabilities. Those are genuinely questions for the elected leadership of the nation. They'll be doing that on advice, of course, but that's a decision for them. It is true. Cheryl made a really good point before about the sorts of threats that Australia faces and what the ADF's primary mission is. And if you go back to my premise before of what is genuinely catastrophic, it is going to be those things that are compounding, that are, as a result of concurrency, that will inevitably means that the capacity of our capabilities is, which are finite, is reached at some point.
Thanks, Rob. A question's come in for you, Jane, with respect to COVID-19, and the question is, in reference to your comments about the Pacific Island neighbours, do you think Australia should be assisting our Pacific Island neighbours, and I'm thinking of the Melanesian neighbours, Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, who have obviously a lower testing capacity than us, and what do you think, if you think we should be assisting more, what do you think this assistance should look like?
Thank you very much for the question. In fact, there is now an agreement between the member states of the Pacific Island Forum, which is called the Pacific Humanitarian Pathway on COVID-19. And it's a high-level mechanism that engages the foreign ministers of the various countries, including Australia, to act upon requests from particular nations for assistance. So the idea there is that it's a formal means of international cooperation at a very high level to do exactly what the question is asking about. I think Australia does have an important role to play, and morally it should be. And I guess it speaks more broadly to what Australia's role is in terms of support and when it comes to development capacity building and building up the resilience of Pacific Island countries. I think as with the COVID-19 situation, dialogue is very important. Rather than imposing what we think might be needed, to talk to our neighbours about what they would like. And in fact, when Cyclone Pam hit Vanuatu a number of years ago, one of the complaints by the national government was, we actually have quite good mechanisms here to respond in the first instance. And while we welcome international support and assistance, we don't need the international community rushing in and telling us what to do. Please let us make the call for what we would like, rather than all these well-intentioned actors coming in and saying, well, this is how to run it. So, yes, I think support from Australia is welcome and needed, but should always be in conversation with the affected country.
Perfect. Thanks, Jane. Here's a question that's come in, which refers to something that Paul Barnes said in response to my first question, and it's open to all of you. Perhaps Cheryl and Rob would be interested too. It refers back to Paul's statement about around systems, and the question is, what part, if any, does systems thinking apply in national crisis management, and as a risk management approach taught at the University of New South Wales, it has a role to play in government planning for such events. Paul, it refers to what you said, so maybe you could kick off on this one.
Thanks, Paul. I think unless we understand what complex systems and how they operate, certainly in so-called peacetime, there's complex things that are happening, and systemic management approaches to dealing with a whole range of issues relevant to societal need. If we don't understand that when disruptions occur and systems, essential services fail and a range of impacts occur, and as Rob said, impacts cascade through time and they accumulate in the severity and the impact. If we don't understand that these cascading impacts will operate as complex failures rather than just simple linear failures, we won't be able to fully grasp the sorts of response and rapid learning, learning as you go, implementing learning and lessons as you are responding. Unless we can rapidly understand that we're dealing with a very complex layered mosaic of phenomena, we won't really be able to do the most effective response. And equally, when things are peaceful again, unless we plan and mitigate for future disaster seasons with full understanding that we're dealing with complex systemic interactions in the natural environment. Bushfires don't just burn things, they upset water supplies, they upset electricity systems, they upset human health in terms of particulate matter in the atmosphere, as we've seen over the last 6 months as well. So there's a range of phenomena that occur, and they are systemic and complex in the way that they manifest and can cause harm. The notion of risk management, having been an academic in that space for over 10 years and still keeping my hand in, I tried to retire from academia, but I keep on getting dragged back to do adjunct roles, is that we do not necessarily teach risk management in the most comprehensive way that we could in this country and in many countries. Risk is a complex phenomena, relates to likelihood and consequence, rapid uncertainty, or rampant uncertainty, I should say. So what would be useful for Australia from a complex systems perspective, and certainly complex project management has been something that's been taught around the country for many years, is that can we bring together a consortium of universities that think in complementary ways, that teach different specialities of the application of risk-based thinking? That would be very useful for the government. It would be very useful for private sector enterprise as well. So definitely we're dealing with non-linear complex systemic phenomena. That's the nature of cascading and cumulative effects.
That's great, Paul. And from a UNSW perspective, I'm sure that we would be interested in engaging in that conversation around collaborative planning research with other universities, and so we can follow up with that.
Well, Paul, one of the universities I'm affiliated with now is University of New South Wales. So this was not a concocted engagement. It was just an accidental manifestation of occurrence.
Very good. Cheryl, did you want to pile on to what Paul had to say, or do you think he pretty much wrapped it up?
I just, first I'd like to agree completely with Paul. I think systems thinking is utterly critical as we go and face those bigger existential catastrophic threats such as climate change. But the other thing I think needs to be twinned with the systems thinking approach is the multidisciplinary approach. We really need, in order to explore those complex cascading connections that Paul has talked about, people that are able to work across domains and across sectors and break these silos of excellence, which often prevent us seeing that we've solved our problem, but we've actually made it worse for someone else in another sector.
Thanks. So another question that's come in, I think I'll fire this one over towards Rob, because it's an interesting one. With the mobilization and mobility of the Australian public service to meet the recent crises, there's been the assumption is that there have been a large number of projects and business as usual functions that have effectively been paused or stopped. What risk do you see to investments previously placed into these areas? And how do we restart these functions and projects once things begin to normalize?
Oh, that's a great question. That really is. And there are a couple of things wrapped up in there. I think we're going to need to be very careful about our definitions of normalizing.
That's true.
I've heard people starting to describe already a post-COVID world. I think we might be living with this particular problem for quite some time. And Paul Barnes' comments about availability of vaccines earlier in this seminar, I think, are probably pretty spot on. It may be that we never have one, or it may be that it's quite some way away. So post-COVID, new normal, up to you how to describe it, I think, colleagues. But I think so we have to make adjustments to the way we do business. It's true, the APS mobilised a lot of people and deployed them in a lot of jobs they normally don't do. I spoke before about the ability for my part of Home Affairs to draw on the other parts of Home Affairs. Well, we set up inside the department the central hub for the national coordination mechanism for COVID-19. If you like, the non-health component that matches the Health Protection Principal Committee that the Chief Medical Officer and Chief Health Officers from the states, plus others, serve on. The health piece, all the other consequences, the NCM was that latter piece. And that was staffed by people who were pulled from all parts of Home Affairs as a central hub, and was given effect by people from all over the APS and in the public services of the other jurisdictions in their own operating areas. So it is true that, and I'll say this with kind of half a self-serving wink, really. The public service did demonstrate pretty reasonable agility, I think, in setting up and continuing to deliver the services that have been required through the government to the public. What the impacts that has on investment and the projects that have been paused? Well, it is true. I've actually decommissioned some work, mothballed others, and I've asked people to focus on the most important issue of the day. But that happens all the time, in a sense. This is just a much more magnified version of it, a much more intense, both temporally and sort of financially, way of doing that. We've been focused on this issue, on the COVID issue, in sort of program management terms, in investment cycle terms, so far for a very short period. This year, really, and this year is only 4 and a bit months old. How are we going to restart? Well, carefully, so that we don't detract and we don't diminish the issues, the capability that we have brought to the COVID problem. We must do that carefully. I don't want to throw away a whole lot of achievements to date for the sake of starting up something that could still remain paused for quite some time. This is the big issue of the day, and we'll be contextualising all of our restarted, recommenced, or indeed new work that has arisen from this, making sure that we keep our efforts going to make sure that Australians remain as safe as they can be.
Could I just add to Rob's comment there, the notion of what the government behind closed doors has achieved should not be discounted. Often people are critical of government, bureaucracy, etc. But can I say, as someone who's not in government but sits in Canberra and is seeing a lot of things and hearing noises behind closed doors of things being done really, really well and effectively in ways that haven't been done before. You know, groups of people coming together, doing rapid planning, rapid action, rapid recommendations to senior decision makers. There are capabilities and lessons that are being learned and applied on the fly that really Australia needs to make sure that its governance arrangements can actually capture that and continue to do it. So there's a range of, and you know, oftentimes public servants can't say too much about what goes on, but there are lessons to learn and compliments to be made to some of the things that I know are happening behind closed doors, and the way in which local, state and federal government agencies are working in ways they've probably never done before or only do so occasionally. And in that sense, the notion of levels of assurance of being able to apply that capability in emergency management or a range of other areas, I think is a critical thing that people listening and people who may have an interest and may see transcripts of this particular webinar, be assured that there's skill sets within government and the private sector that are coming together currently that you may not know about, but there are definitely need to be preserved in terms of some of the things that have been done. And one of the areas that, you know, I think could be added on to that is a couple of the states have roles called Inspector Generals of Emergency Management. And their roles, this is Queensland and Victoria, their roles have been put in place post very large emergencies and disasters to give a level of assurance that capability and capacity is at its optimal level in a range of pre, during and after contexts for large disruptions. So an element that would be really useful to add on to the sorts of skill sets and applications that I'm alluding to would be levels of assurance frameworks that are sitting at a federal level that complement what's happening at a state and local government level, that allow senior decision makers to understand that the most optimal application of capability and capacity and the sorts of capabilities I've alluded to that are being applied now that most people don't know about, that we can sustain that level of skill and support for that level of skill. Because if you don't match complex arrangements and capabilities to complex systems and complex threat contexts, you won't be able to move forward and have the most effective response. So look, I just wanted to say that the sorts of stuff that Rob's alluding to, I think members of the public really should appreciate there's some amazing things happening within government in collaboration with the private sector.
Thanks, Paul. I think that actually was a very good sort of summary of some of the key issues that we've all been addressing here. And given the time, I'm going to now wrap up this webinar by firstly thanking all of those in our audience that took time out today to join us. And thank you very much for an outstanding set of questions. It shows not only are you engaged, but you were listening carefully, and it certainly has energized all members of the panel, all 450 plus of you. So thank you for joining us here today. And my particular thanks, of course, to our panelists, Rob Cameron, Jane McAdam, Paul Barnes, and Cheryl Durrant. I know all of you will join me in a virtual round of applause. Very busy people, especially Rob over there at EMA. Thanks for taking the time to be with us. Thank you for sharing your knowledge, your experiences, your advice, your wisdom. these are the issues of the day. These are the issues that every Australian wakes up to in the morning and thinks of last, I think, before falling asleep. These are really interesting times. And it's great to know that there are folks like you who are leading at the operational level, leading the thought leadership, and clearly setting Australia up as an example of what can be achieved when everyone at all levels leans in together to deal with some really challenging circumstances. I think that Australia is certainly setting a fine example in terms of response. And great doing this virtually. It's been a real pleasure to be your moderator. And I wish you all a great day. Stay safe out there. Continue that social distancing. No complacency is allowed. Just keep doing what needs to be done. Follow the advice of authorities at all levels, and we will continue as a nation to move confidently ahead. So everyone, have a great day. Thank you very much.